Well, the Treasury Department, like every other federal agency, has put out contingency plans, understanding that this might actually happen. Much of Treasury operations will continue as normal, so at least for the short term. So Social Security recipients will continue to receive their checks. Payments will generally continue to be processed. Within Treasury, the big disruption in operations will come from the IRS. So, for example, the IRS has said that it may have to stop processing some tax transcripts. So think about when you apply for a mortgage and you get this tax transcript, that might be interrupted. And so roughly half of IRS employees will not report to work, is my understanding in reading the contingency plan on day one of the shutdown.
We got a warning from Moody's. I'm sure you saw that, Ben, just a couple of days ago, threatening to join Fitch and S&P in removing our top credit ratings. How likely is that to happen, knowing that we'll continue paying our debt?
Well, Fitch obviously felt comfortable doing it. And Fitch, if you read the justification for the shutdown, what was featured centrally in that was the inability for the U.S. government to continue doing its job. And so this just feels like this massive unforced error. I mean, we have known about the start of the fiscal year for literally years. We've had a framework for this going back to May when you saw that bipartisan compromise coming out setting discretionary spending levels. So this is not a surprise to appropriators. It's not a surprise to Matt Gaetz. It's not a surprise to the extremists in the House who are trying to blow all of this up. So, I think that what we can expect moving forward is a lot of displeasure, not just from American people, but also from legislators who felt like they had a deal in place.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, if the downgrade is going to be based on chaos and deficit spending, how about we just rip off the Band-Aid, because neither will be changing anytime soon, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to focus on the crisis which is directly in front of us, and this is a government shutdown. One point I want to make is that not all government shutdowns are created equally. So you go back to 1995, we had that 21-day shutdown, but that only impacted about a quarter of discretionary spending, and military was not included. You go back to the shutdown that happened under the Trump administration that lasted for 35 days, only about 33% of government spending was impacted, and the military was not included. We're talking about the whole suite of appropriations bills here. 100% of discretionary spending is potentially on the table. So this shutdown could even be worse than ones we've seen in the past.
I saw you in the deal book this morning, Ben, and you were talking about the impact that this might have on Fed officials' ability to manage inflation, to forecast, to model around the economy. And you wrote, quote, "It's like a pilot trying to land a plane without knowing what the runway looks like." That's where we are now.
That's where we are now. And, the Fed is just another example of an entity in the U.S. economy that relies on the government for either information or for processing or for providing services. And so the Fed is obviously in the middle of a very difficult period when it comes to making decisions around FOMC. And we may ask members of the Fed to make a decision about monetary policy without knowing what the unemployment rate is, and that is just crazy. And I'm not sure that these really extremist members of the House are, considering this as part of their calculus when they're pulling all these stunts.
Well, I suppose not, but we should remind our viewers and our listeners here, Ben, that we will not get economic data until this is solved. That could be weeks. The impact on the markets alone, being in the dark like that, could be significant.
Exactly. We have no idea how long this is going to last for. And a lot of the economic disruption intensifies over time. So you've probably heard that TSA screeners, air traffic controllers, will report to work on day one. That's true, but look, these people all have bills to pay, and if they're not being paid, they have to go make the money somewhere else. And so when we've seen in really long government shutdowns in the past is that you start to see these increased rates of these workers calling in sick. Look, our nation's domestic travel system is pretty central to the U.S. economy, and if it means you can't go through security, if it means you can't safely travel on an airplane because an air traffic controller isn't reporting to work, that's a pretty steep economic cost. And I could give you a dozen different examples about how this impacts the U.S. economy. But the point is that the magnitude of the shock, the intensity of the disruption, increases over time.
Yeah. Well, isn't that right? Is it possible, maybe you can bring us inside the Treasury Department here for a moment. Will they have their own estimates on economic data? Would Commerce, for instance, have its own? Does the White House have data that just simply won't be released publicly, or those numbers will not be available, period?
Those numbers will not be available, period. Now, you've seen some Fed officials say, look, we can turn to other sources of data. They can turn to private sources of data to try to get a sense of what's going on. But if I'm on the FOMC, or if I'm staffing someone on the FOMC, I really want the best data possible so that person can make the best informed decision. There's nothing that substitutes for a federal inflation report. There's nothing that substitutes for the employment report. That's too comprehensive, too well established, and there's really no substitute for those data sources.